Joshua Glover was a slave, and he made it all the way to Wisconsin. And the fugitive slave law, signed by Democrat President Millard Fillmore, you had a slave catcher catch Joshua Glover and put him in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin jail. And you had about 5,000 white Wisconsins storm the jail and free Joshua Glover. And here's the historical marker. Rescue of Joshua Glover. Joshua Glover was a runaway slave who sought freedom in Racine in 1852. 1854, his Missouri owner used the Fugitive Slave Act to apprehend him. 1850 law permitted slave catchers to cross state lines, capture him, escape. Glover was taken to Milwaukee and imprisoned. Word spread about Glover's incarceration, and a great crowd gathered around the jail demanding his release. They beat down the jail door, released Joshua Glover. He eventually was escorted to Canada. And anyway, so I think it's interesting. Here's what the newspaper, the Sauk County Standard, said in 1854. An estimated 5,000 white Republicans stormed the jail. Right, there's the free Joshua Glover. Free Joshua Glover now. 2 days after these white Wisconsins free Joshua Glover, they go to Ripon, Wisconsin, and they form an anti-slavery party called the Republican Party. And the historical marker says, the Glover incident helped galvanize abolitionist sentiment in Wisconsin. The case eventually led to the state Supreme Court to defy the federal government by declaring the fugitive slave law unconstitutional. So the Republican Party original platform was to eliminate slavery and polygamy. So in 1856, it adopts its first party platform. The convention of delegates are opposed to the extension of slavery into free territory. With our Republican fathers, we hold it to be self-evident truth that all men are endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that the primary object and ulterior design of our federal government were to secure these rights to all persons. Our Republican fathers abolished slavery in all our national territory, the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, I talked about that already. It becomes our duty to maintain this provision against all attempts to violate it for the purpose of establishing slavery. We deny the authority of Congress to give legal existence to slavery. Can you imagine a party saying, we're going to... It is both the right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. Now, polygamy, what's that? Well, that's where a guy can have lots of wives. So here you had the Republican Party founding by saying, marriage is one man and one woman. And to eliminate slavery. Anti-slavery Republicans organized in other states, and they were aided by church members. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists. Here's one. Anti-Slavery Society in Michigan was held. The society met at the First Presbyterian Church, and Michigan held the first state Republican convention. Then Indiana did, and then Ohio did, and then New York did, and then they've had the first Republican convention. The first Republican convention, Pittsburgh, 1856, called on Americans to what? Resist and overthrow the present national administration of Democrat President Franklin Pierce. We're going to resist and overthrow the, and as it is identified with the progress of the slave power to national supremacy. And they had their nominating convention. They selected John C. Fremont to be their first presidential candidate. He lost, but Nixon then won the next time around. Now this is interesting. This is the first African Baptist church in Richmond, Virginia. And in 1865, it hosted the first Republican state convention in Virginia. Virginia's first Republican convention was held in the First African Baptist Church. And 1857, Supreme Court, 7 of the 9 are Democrats, justices. They decided that Dred Scott was not a citizen, but property. And I actually served for years on the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, and they successfully were able to put a statue of Dred Scott and his wife Harriet at the foot of the courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri, the old courthouse that he was sold on. Now there's a statue of him there. Lynn Jackson is the woman who's the great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott. And so she heads that up. And anyway, Roger Taney, that decided the Dred Scott case, was put on by Democrat Andrew Jackson. And Taney wrote this in his Dred Scott decision, that slaves were so far inferior that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his own benefit. Talk about racism. And then 1856, pro-slavery Democrat Preston Brooks sneaks up on the abolitionist Republican Senator Charles Sumner and beats him nearly to death on the floor of the U.S. Capitol, right? Charles Sumner had given a speech. He says that slavery is the mistress of the South, and all this. He's like, and so the next day, all the Democrats show up with pistols, and it's like, okay, So let's see here. By those, if you're not familiar, Dred Scott had been a slave, taken with his master to Illinois, Wisconsin, but he didn't read, so he didn't know the newspapers, that he could have just walked away from his master, because those were free states. And then when he gets back to Missouri, he has some friends that help him sue for his freedom. And one of them is Henry Blow, a Republican congressman, whose wife started the first kindergarten in the United States. And my dad was a historian, and he did the historical marker in Carondelet, Missouri, and that's where the Blow family lived. And so he put that on the marker. So Lincoln. He didn't believe that we should honor the Dred Scott decision. He says, we think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know that the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this. So imagine the Supreme Court making erroneous decisions. And then in his inaugural address, he says, if the policy of the government on vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decision of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. So we're in charge, right? Not them. They're our servants. And so we have the, amen. Now, I thought this was interesting. Prior to the Civil War, the country was divided geographically from north to south. So you had the radical Republican North that said slavery is wrong, end it now. Right? Abolitionist societies, underground railroads, and so forth. Moderate Republican North that says slavery is wrong, but we got to transition out of it slowly over time. You want to make sure that they can support themselves before you push them off the plantation. And the practical neutral that didn't care about that. They just care about jobs and economy and checks and so forth. And then the moderate Democrat South that said slavery is wrong, but it's been here for centuries. Just treat your slave nice. And then the extreme Democrat South that said slavery is good. Let's expand it to all these new Western territories that are coming into the Union. And so let's go through those real quick. Radical Republican North, slavery's wrong, end it now. Moderate North, transition out of it over time. Practical neutral, they cared only about jobs, finances. Moderate Democrat South, wrong, but live with it. Extreme Democrat South, slavery should be expanded. I thought it was interesting. Those same categories are today with the pro-life. So you have the pro-life Republicans, abortion's wrong, end it now. And then the establishment rhino Republicans, take your time. And then the practical neutrals only care about welfare checks and jobs and economy. And the pro-choice Democrats, it's a wrong, but live with it and have it be rare and safe and so forth. And then the extreme pro-choice Democrats that want it to be expanded. They want you to pay for it. Even the little sisters of the poor that take vows of chastity, And then they want to use the United Nations to push it around the world. And Reagan noticed the similarity that I just showed you. He wrote in Conscience of the Nation, Lincoln recognized that we could not survive as a free land when some men could decide that others were not fit to be free and should be slaves. Likewise, we cannot survive as a free nation when some men decide that others are not fit to live and should be abandoned to abortion. I mean, it's geographic, right? You're 2 inches over the border from, Kentucky into Illinois, and you're free. You're 2 inches over the border from Illinois into Kentucky, you're property. You're 2 inches outside of the room, you're a citizen. You're 2 inches in the room, you're property. Reagan said, whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. So Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and some consider that an overreach because it's a proclamation, it's not a law. So then he turns around and he spends a whole lot of effort to pass the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And every Republican congressman votes for it, and every Republican senator. Only 4 Democrats and the Senate and 15 in the House vote for it. Once Southern Democrats were forced to free their slaves, they attempted to re-enslave them by passing what's called black codes. So they would say, yeah, you're free, but you gotta have a job, and if we catch you without a job, then we're gonna make, they required former slaves to be apprenticed to employers, which is basically you're back in slavery, and punished if they left. And sharecroppers weren't any better off. Many southern states in the black codes prohibited blacks from owning weapons. No freedman, Negro, or mulatto shall carry or keep firearms or ammunition. Mississippi Black Code, 1865. Could you imagine the government not wanting you to have guns? And on November 1865, Republicans denounced Mississippi's Democrat legislature for being systemically racist. The black codes, and let's see. So there's a Republican, Thaddeus Stevens, introduces a bill to give former slaves 40 acres and a mule. Democrats opposed it, led by President Andrew Johnson. Republicans overrode Andrew Johnson's veto to pass Civil Rights Act of 1866, conferring right to citizenship on freed slaves. To force southern states to extend the right to state citizenship to former slaves, Republicans pushed through the 14th Amendment. 100% of Democrats voted against the 14th Amendment. And Republican John Farnsworth says the reason for the adoption of the 14th Amendment was because of discriminating legislation of those states by which they were punishing one class of men under different laws from another class. And then they had Jim Crow laws and to keep the former slaves from voting. Republicans granted voting rights to former slaves in the District of Columbia, overriding again Democrat Andrew Johnson's veto. They passed another legislation protecting voting rights of all freed slaves, overriding the Democrat President Johnson's veto. And then the Republicans begin to impeach President Andrew Johnson. And then Democrats in Georgia's Senate expel black civil rights activist Tunis Campbell and 24 other black Republicans. They just kick him out, but then they're later reinstated by the Republican Congress. Republicans pushed through the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing freed slaves the right to vote. And Tuskegee Institute recorded that between 1882 and 1968, there were 4,743 lynchings. There were more than those, but those are documented. And out of those, 3,446 were blacks, and 1,297 were white radical Republicans down in the South registering freed blacks to vote. Think of that. Almost 1 out of every 4 or 5 lynchings was a white Republican that was lynched because they were down in the South registering to free blacks to vote. Spanish-American War, the blacks and whites fought together. General Pershing says, white regiments, black regiments representing young manhood of the North and South fought shoulder to shoulder, unmindful of race or color, unmindful of whether commanded by ex-Confederate or not, and mindful of only their common duty as Americans. Then you have black codes, the separate but equal, and the dumpy train cars were the ones that the blacks were forced to be on. So there's a case, 1892. Black man Homer Plessy was arrested for violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act. Supreme Court upheld the racial discrimination in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, calling it separate but equal. But defying that, 1901, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt hosts the first black man to have dinner in the White House, Booker T. Washington. And he caught flack for that from the South. And 1914, Woodrow Wilson is back in charge, and he segregates the military, reversing 50 years of integration. And Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, has a filming of a KKK film in the White House. And he considers Plessy versus Ferguson as stare decisis, settled law. And so he says, segregation is not humiliation, but a benefit, and distinctively to the advantage of the color. He's trying to talk him into it. And then he segregates the Army, Navy, Postal Service, Treasury, and so forth. And this was PragerU did this. And it says, Woodrow Wilson shared many views of the KKK and so forth. And so in 1921, Democrat white supremacists destroyed Tulsa's Black Wall Street, killing 300, leaving 10,000 homeless. Now, it's sort of interesting that critical race theory tries to say, well, it was black versus white. No, it's Democrat versus Republican. It's not a racial issue, it's a political issue. And anyway, FDR appoints a KKK member, Hugo Black, to the Supreme Court. as the just as black reveal, the Ku Klux Klansmen. And to gain support of the Democrat South, FDR agrees to block enforcement of anti-lynching laws. And then another little side chapter is during World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army had Korean, Chinese, Philippine comfort women, one woman for every 70 soldiers. And the Japanese and then the Japanese women who volunteered during the war for factory work or to be nurses, they were taken and made into comfort women, right? And so, again, this fallen, selfish human nature. And it comes in all colors, but what matters is the software that's running on the brain. Is it love your neighbor or is it selfish? And then you have Democrat Congressman Lyndon Johnson from Texas. When there was a civil rights bill, because this civil rights bill is a farce and a sham. I'm opposed to that program. I have voted against the so-called poll tax repeal bill, and I have voted against the so-called anti-lynching bill. There was a bill to stop lynching, and he votes against it. During World War II, Republican General Eisenhower forbade racism and made the decision to arm black American soldiers with weapons. 1948, Democrat candidate for president Strom Thurmond says there's not enough troops in the Army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools. 1952, 1956, a majority of black Americans vote for a Republican, President Dwight Eisenhower. 1953, Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, chaired a committee to eliminate discrimination on the basis of race and color in the employment practices of the federal government. 1954, Supreme Court justices reject the stare decisis, or the settled law of Plessy versus Ferguson, and they get rid of separate but equal, and they have Brown versus the Board of Education, prohibiting racial discrimination. Eisenhower immediately orders desegregation of the Washington, D.C. public schools. And then Eisenhower proposes a civil rights bill to enforce the 15th Amendment, strengthening the rights of blacks to vote. Democrat Senator Strom Thurmond filibusters Eisenhower's civil rights bill for 24 hours. And instead of voting for Eisenhower's civil rights bill, Democrat Senator John F. Kennedy delayed it by voting to have it sent to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Doris Kearns Goodwin writes in the book Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream, quoted Democrat Senator Lyndon Johnson telling Democrat Senator Richard Russell regarding the Civil Rights Act of 1957, "These Negroes are getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us since they've got something now they've never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference." LBJ goes on, "For if we don't move at all, then their allies will line up against us, and there'll be no way of stopping them. We'll lose the filibuster. There'll be no way of putting a brake on all sorts of wild legislation. It will be Reconstruction all over again." What's Reconstruction? That's after the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant had the federal troops down in the South to prevent discrimination. So, September 4th, 1957, Democrat Arkansas Governor Orville Fabus stood at the door of the Central High School in Little Rock with the Arkansas National Guard and blocked 9 black students from coming inside. Southern Democrat governors resisted desegregation. Republican Eisenhower was hated by Democrat governors for sending troops south to force racial integration of the public schools, as he had previously integrated the military. Democrat Birmingham Commissioner Bull Connor, who had close ties with the KKK, stated in 1957, "Segregation laws are still constitutional, and I promise you that until they are removed from the ordinance books of Birmingham, they will be enforced in Birmingham to the utmost of my ability and by all lawful means." Now, Birmingham, that's where Republican former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was from, and she was on The View in 2018 regarding Democrat Bull Connor. She says, "Let me tell you why I'm a defender of the Second Amendment. I was a little girl growing up in Birmingham, Alabama in the late 50s, early 60s. There was no way that Bull Connor, a Democrat, and the Birmingham police were going to protect you. And so when the white night riders would come through our neighborhood, my father and his friends would take their guns and they'd go to the head of the neighborhood. It's a little cul-de-sac, and they would fire in the air if anybody came through. I don't think they actually ever hit anyone, but they protected the neighborhood. I'm sure that if Bull Connor had known where those guns were, he would have rounded them up. And so, I don't favor some things like gun registration." Now, I just thought I'd put this in here. Again, more slavery today than any other time in world history. These are current news headlines. More than 200 children remain abducted in Nigeria and kidnapped. I was driving, I don't know, I go a lot of places, and my Uber driver was from Nigeria. And he said, it was a Yoruba tribe, there's the Igbo and the Yoruba, and then there's another tribe. And he goes, it's the other tribe that's Islamic and with Boko Haram. And he says, it's horrible, they're kidnapping kids all the time. And he says, there's videos of them going onto a bus and they're asking them their tribe, what tribe they were. And if they say the wrong one, they just kill them right there and they get it on their camera. He says, it's horrible. He says, they're on the verge of a civil war. Why aren't everybody that hates racism, so why aren't they talking about what's really happening right now in Nigeria and coming to their defense and stopping that injustice? These are black lives that matter in Nigeria. Here's another one. Nigerian gangs kidnap children on behalf of Boko Haram. So back to my history, and if I keep your attention a little longer. Is this interesting? Yes. I always hope I don't do information overload, but you can. So in 1958, Republican President Eisenhower meets with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the White House. Eisenhower proposed a civil rights bill in 1959, but Senate Democrats filibustered it and watered it down. 1959, when Southern Democrats demanded that this proposed civil rights bill include a provision that if anyone violated the law, they should be tried before an all-white jury. And Republican Vice President Nixon gave the deciding vote against that Democrat addition to the bill. And then Alabama's Democrat governor, George Wallace, in 1963, blocks the entrance of the University of Alabama, stating, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And that same year was when Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. And he refers to Democrat Governor George Wallace in his I Have a Dream speech. He says this, I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. So federal troops escorted black students to class, Democrats in the South, after the Birmingham children's protest in 1963, where police dogs and fire hoses were used against blacks. Kennedy called for a bill emulating the Republican Civil Rights Act of 1875. But the Southern Democrats opposed this. And former KKK Klansman, Senator Robert Byrd, the longest-serving Democrat senator and the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Byrd admitted you had to be in the Klan to advance in the Democrat Party. And Democrat Secretary of State Hillary Clinton praised Byrd in a eulogy. Today our country has lost a true American original, my friend and mentor, Robert Byrd. It's almost impossible to imagine the United States Senate without Robert Byrd. He was not just the longest-serving member, he was its heart and soul. From my first day in the Senate, I sought out his guidance. 1964, the Democrat senators, look at this, from March 10th to March 30th to June 10th, they had a filibuster of a civil rights bill. Democrat Senator Albert Gore Sr. and these others, for 71 days, the United States Senate was completely frozen with a filibuster, and the Democrats opposed the civil rights bill. The Democrat Senator Richard Russell, 1964, says, we will resist to the bitter end any movement which would have a tendency to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of the races in our southern states. Democrat Senator Strom Thurmond during this time said, this so-called civil rights proposal with which the president has sent to Capitol Hill for enactment into law are unconstitutional, unnecessary, unwise, extend beyond the limits of reason. This is the worst civil rights package ever presented to Congress, and is reminiscent of the Reconstruction proposals and actions of the radical Republican Congress. He's referring back to right after the Civil War, the radical Republicans, right? They were wanting to give freedom and all the rights. He says, we're going to go back to that. This is 1964. They're still identifying with that. So June 10th, 1964, Senator Byrd, that Hillary liked, he filibustered the Civil Rights Bill for 14 hours and 13 minutes. Now, LBJ, he saw the political winds shifting. And so he had a watered-down compromise bill proposed, and he signed it. And Dinesh D'Souza pointed out in the Independent Whig, September 1st, 2016, more Republicans proportionally voted for that Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Fair Housing Bill of 1968 than Democrats did. Lyndon Johnson immediately followed up by introducing his Great Society entitlement welfare programs. It was a Cloward-Piven strategy to backdoor the country into socialist dependency. So it's like, okay, we're going to do the Civil Rights Bill, and we're not going to intimidate them at the voting booth like we've done. We're going to do something new. Richard Clow and Francis Piven were Columbia University sociologists, and they were left-leaning political activists. And so they came up with a backdoor way to get the country into socialism. And it's a strategy involved virtue signaling or posing to care for the poor, while the real purpose was to create a permanent class of dependent voters. And I showed this before, but this was the 1934 Chicago Tribune cartoon, and if you zoom in on it, that's the plan of action for the U.S. spend, 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 right? Under these welfare programs, and then it says here, depleting the resources, and then that little sign on there, it says young pinkies from Columbia and Harvard. You can't really see it there. But Columbia University is where Cloward and Piven were. So he's talking about this. So LBJ did the big switch. The big switch is not Republicans and Democrats switching places regarding race issues. It was the Democrat Party switching tactics on how to manipulate minority voters. And the switch was from intimidation to entitlement. Did you catch that? They want to control, but instead of doing it through hosing them down and sicking dogs, you create a Cloward-Piven dependent class. And if you think of it for a moment, it's very powerful. Imagine if you were getting a $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know. Week after week, month after month, $1,000. After a few years of that, would you ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? I mean, I'd be like, well, my kid's got a few more bills to pay, right? Once you get people to receive free money from you, you have a very strong pull for them to want to keep you in office. It's an election strategy. In other words, instead of suppressing African American vote through intimidation, control them through dependency on entitlement programs. Now, according to Ron Kessler's book, Inside the White House, written in 1996, Lyndon Johnson had a reputation of vulgarity in private conversations, and believe me, some of the stuff written are really, really vulgar. But LBJ told two hesitant Democrat governors aboard Air Force One, and again, this is in the book, Inside the White House, Ron Kessler, who served with all kinds of presidents. So LBJ tells these Democrat governors, if they go along with his switch from intimidation to entitlement, he says, I'll have those, and then he uses the N-word, voting Democrat for the next 200 years. And even Malcolm X noticed this. 1963, he says, the liberal is more deceitful and hypocritical than the conservative. The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend. The white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or weapon in this political football game. The white liberal controls this ball through tricks and tokenism and false promises. Well, just a little bit up to date. Patrisse Cullors, founder of the BLM, she says, we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia are part of the trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. So, trained Marxists. What's the Marxist theory? It's critical theory. It's critical race theory, critical economic. You divide the country into groups, and then you pit the groups against each other to cause division and domestic instability and insecurity, and then everybody panics, and they'll surrender their freedoms to the government that promises to restore peace. That's the trained Marxist theory that she's talking about. And so you send in agitators, organizers, agent provocateurs, and their goal is to stir up rioting. And then when the people get panicky enough, they usurp power. So you create a problem that's real bad. Everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. That becomes the new starting point. You create another problem that's real bad. Everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad. Everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. This is the Marx. This is the theory. And each time you settle, the people give up a little more of their freedoms, a little more, until it's all reconcentrated back into the state. Patrisse Cullors was trained by Eric Mann. He was a leader of the Weather Underground in the 1970s. What's the Weather Underground? Oh, well, you know them because they bombed New York City's police headquarters and bombed San Francisco's police department and killed policemen, and they bombed the U.S. Capitol. They did? Yeah, it was in the news. March 1st, 1971. Talk about an insurrection attack on the Capitol, but they're on the left, so they get off the hook. And so one of the Weather Underground people is Bill Ayers, and he launched the political career of Barack Obama. And then another BLM founder, Opal Tometi, is there with the Marxist dictator, Nicolas Maduro. And on their BLM website, they had this, accessed on June 12th, 1920. We make space for transgendered, work to dismantle cisgendered privilege and uplift trans folk, especially trans women. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family. We foster queer affirming network, freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexuals unless she, he, or they disclose otherwise. It's like, what did you just say? It's a bait and switch. A whole lot of people that thought BLM was going to do, had no clue that the three founders are trans activists wanting to destroy the family, doing all kinds of this kind of stuff. And I did screenshots of the page just in case they had ever taken it down. So one of the black men that was disillusioned and became a communist was Manning Johnson. I mentioned him before, and he was a communist for 10 years, ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And then he realized that the communists didn't want to help his people, right? And he mentioned that in his book, you can go online, the website's still up there, but I also quote him in my book on socialism. But he talks about how there were some successful black businessmen that wanted to build a real estate development and have it be beautiful with fountains and streets, and they sabotaged it. And then some other black businessmen wanted to build a first-class hospital. He says, Jews have hospitals, Catholics, everybody, and they wanted to have it, and they got sabotaged. And he saw them sabotage one. He goes, they really don't want to help us. They want to keep us going so they can use us to sow division. Sort of like Yasser Arafat in the Middle East, right? So all the different countries, they absorb people, but Yasser Arafat wanted to keep the Palestinians unabsorbed so that he can maintain and use them to bring division. And anyway, so Manning Johnson, in his book, Color, Communism, and Common Sense, foreword is written by Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt. He writes this: after 2 years of practical training in organizing street demonstrations and inciting mob violence and how to fight the police, throw a brick and hide. I put this in there because Patrisse Cullors says that she was a trained Marxist, right? So this is him who said this is what his training was. I was given an intensive course in the theory and practice of red political warfare that changed me from a novice into a dedicated red professional revolutionist. But some people are seeing through it. I thought this was interesting. NBA player Charles Barkley said, man, I think most white people and black people are great people. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. And I thought this was an interesting quote from Burgess Owens, former NFL player. Yahoo News has the article. And he says, on the concept of reparation, Burgess Owens, formerly of the Jets and Raiders, spoke during hearing for H.R. 40. I used to be a Democrat until I did my history and found the misery that party brought to my race. Let's pay restitution. How about the Democrat Party pay for all the misery brought to my race? Now, again, I point out that it is the software, not the hardware. It's the people need to get born again. And if they truly get born again, they're going to love everybody and do unto the least of these what you do unto Jesus. That's the answer. It's not political. We need, the word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. So politics is simply the business of the city. You look at the founding of America. I have a book called Who is the King? In America, it's you. But I go through colonial New England. You have the Baptist founded Providence, Rhode Island, and the Congregationalists founded Hartford, Connecticut. There was nobody else in Hartford except the Congregationalist Christians, and they had to be involved in the business of the city. I mean, they couldn't sit back because there wasn't anybody but the Christians, right? You look at John Wheelwright and his church found Exeter, New Hampshire. There's nobody in Exeter, New Hampshire except his church members because they founded the city. So everybody in the church was involved in the business of the city. Right? So this idea of, oh, we're not supposed to get involved, it's like, that's something they're pushing on us. And anyway. Well, in trying to find a place to land, I thought, I've read a lot of history. And you've been so kind as to listen to a lot of history. And one of the things I've seen is that every single generation has a crisis. Bubonic plague, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, World War I, Spanish flu. And you know what? If we get through our present crises, there'll be another one. We get through that crisis, there'll be another one. Jesus says the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. There's always going to be crises. We want to turn things around. We really, really do, and we're going to work to do that. But it's almost like the Lord knows that there's going to be crises. And he, we had... I'm part of a group, and they, for years, we're fighting the Soviet Union. Finally, the wall comes down, and there's no more communism. And then, and now we've got the Sharia Islam thread, and then we got the social. I've been around long enough, so I've been through a couple of these battles. There's always going to be battles. And it's almost like the Lord knows what time period that you're living. He chose for you to be alive at this time period. He knows all the dirty deals, all the back room. He knows everything that I just shared with you. And he thinks you've got what it takes. And it's like the crisis of the era is a self-sorting out on a mini level of the sheep and the goats. It's not the ultimate sorting out of the sheep and the goats. When, Lord, were you naked and we clothed you? It's not that, but it's on a small level. The crisis of the era is a opportunity for the people that are alive in that era to show whose side they're on. Are you going to run and hide? Are you going to give up? Are you going to, like it says in, what was that scripture that says, pretend like I'm not seeing it, but the Lord knows you do see it, but you're just going to sort of ignore it? Is your goal in life to tiptoe from one side to the other without stepping on a landmine and just hope you get to the end and die without having to go through any confrontation? So, freshman chemistry class, there is a beaker with a solution, and you pour in a catalyst, and it causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates and gets heavy and falls to the bottom, and other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and floats to the top. The time period that you are living in is the solution in the beaker. The catalyst that's poured in is the crisis of the time period. And some people precipitate and drop out and run and hide and get scared and fearful. And other people get effervescent and get bubbly. And they say, Lord, use me. There's a crisis out there. Use me to love the unlovable. Use me to defend the defenseless. Use me to stand up for righteousness. Use me when it looks hopeless. You know the early church? I mean, the church was born into a one-world anti-Christian government, the Roman Empire. Evidently, God's not afraid. And for 3 centuries, that was a Christian experience. And they prayed for what? That the crisis would go away? No, they prayed for boldness. And so the idea is the Lord is looking at how we act. And it's exciting. I was thinking, especially us guys, we like conflict. I mean, I hate to say you don't, but you do. I mean, I'm one of 11 kids. I got 5 brothers. And growing up, we would like fight all the time. I mean, if there's nothing, we'd walk down a road and there'd be one brother would pick up a little piece of gravel and he would like plink it at the other brother's head. For no other reason than just the other one would pick up a little one and he'd plink it back, and the other one would pick up one, and then the rocks would get a little bit bigger. Then they get bigger until pretty soon you're like pelting each other with rocks. And I found if you're ever in a rock fight, with your left hand, throw a handful really high, and then you can wing some line drives. But imagine if there was nothing to do, right? You get to heaven, and there's all the great saints, and they're talking about standing up to Pharaoh and standing up to Goliath, and they go, oh, what did you do? Because it was all done by the time I came around. I mean, all the babies were fed, all the diseases were cured. They're going to say, boring. So for the rest of eternity, you'll be known as the boring story guy, you know? We sort of crave it. You know, one time I was like, I mean, imagine if you could like go away to an island and be away from all these problems. And it'd be pretty nice for, you know, for a day, a couple days, a week, a couple weeks, a month. After a while, you'd probably go crazy. It's like, what's going on back there? I want to know what's going on. And then what if you knew like one of your family members and they're like in a situation, you go, oh, I know the answer. I mean, one time I thought about being in heaven. You know, I ran for Congress 3 times. I ran against Dick Gephardt. He was the Nancy Pelosi before the Nancy Pelosi. And he spent $9 million trying to destroy me. That's sort of, you know, not too many people get that opportunity, you know. I mean, he'd run negative ads against me every day, and I mean, all kinds of stuff. And my kids and I would be like, we didn't know that, you know. One of my books, it's called America's God and Country, Encyclopedia Quotations. It sold 500,000 copies. I mean, had the U.S. Supreme Court even cited by name in 2014. And anyway, he did a commercial. And he at a debate, he took the video and he froze. This is back in the year 2000. Froze the frames with my eyes were half closed, so I look like I'm inebriated. And the screen's black and white, and it says Bill Federer, Too Extreme from Missouri. It has my book slide across the screen, and then it says, you know, Too Extreme from Missouri. And he played that every day. People say, what's the... Oh, and then he'd say that I don't know how they found it, that some group in Montana called the Montana Militia had a website where they had hundreds of books, and mine was one of the books. And so the ad was him in color with all the old people and little children. And then it turns black and white with my eyes half open. And this book, Too Extreme from Missouri, and he even supplies books to the Montana Militia. People, what's that? I don't know. And so like a couple years later, my brother asked me to speak at his child's class. You know, you get the grown up to come and tell their career, and I did a book on George Washington Carver. And so I'm in front of the class, and the teacher says, now this is Bill Federer. He's an author. And the one little kid raises his hand. I mean, the kid's feet don't even touch the floor. He goes, oh, I remember you, Bill Federer, Too Extreme from Missouri. You know, it's like, and anyway, but during that time period, I thought, you know, oh, it'd just be nice just to like die and be in heaven and be with the Lord. It'd be so nice, it'd be so wonderful. And then I would think, oh, that's great. And then I would, after, you know, being up there for a couple weeks, I'd be like, what's going on down on earth? And I want to look over the edge to see. And then I would sort of see, like, you know, I could have handled that. I could have handled a little bit more. I mean, you know. Or maybe see one of your kids think, look, they're facing a problem. Oh, I can help them. Oh, no, I can't help them. I'm already in heaven. I think that's what praise and worship does. Praise and worship is an opportunity for us to escape and be in the presence of the Lord. And then we open our eyes, we're back down on earth, we can handle it again for another, you know, week or whatever. So anyway, so the idea is just want to encourage you and let you know that someday you'll be dead. But you'll be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. So I heard one person say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. So imagine in heaven, you're in heaven, you're walking the streets of gold, and you meet Moses. And Moses invites you over to his place. I don't know what it's like up there, but Jesus did say, in my Father's house there are many mansions. So I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in the fireplace. Anyway. And yeah, so I'll show up late, and my wife will say, where were you? So I was thinking about something else, you know. But imagine being there. And maybe it's like tonight. Maybe he's got a big living room. And after all the small talk's over, you ask him, say, Moses, what was it like? I mean, I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet, Moses will stand up, and he goes, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging at us with these brand new chariot wheels and these sharp swords, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there, holding out my staff, and I said, God, use me to deliver your nation. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet. David will stand up. He goes, I was just a teenager. And this thug Goliath was mocking our God and making fun of our faith, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything about it. I said, enough of that. I took my little sling and went out there and hit him in the head, and I took his own sword and I chopped his head off. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to see Gideon. Tell us your story. Well, there's 100,000 Midianites. I got 30,000 Israelites, and God said, too many. Tell everyone that's scared to go home. Great, now I'm down to 10,000. Still too many. Go drink from a creek. Whittles it to 300. And then God says, okay, watch this. All right? God loves to wait till it looks hopeless, and then he raises up little nobodies that are small in their own eyes and big in faith and courage. And then there's Deborah and the Apostle Paul. And one by one, everybody in Moses' living room is going to tell their story. It's going to be really exciting. And then everybody in the room is going to look at you. Says, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What was going on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What were they saying about God in your country, or the baby in the mother's womb, or marriage that God himself instituted? What did you do when the whole world was against you? What did you do when it looked hopeless? What did you do when you were even backstabbed by some of your Christian friends? What did you do? What did you do? You just kept your eyes on Jesus, right? And all that you had was a little thread of faith, but you trusted in the Lord, and it turned into a string and a rope and a cable, and finally the blessings of God came back into your life. You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in the room, and Jesus to have a big screen and show all kinds of great things happen and miracles and people coming to the Lord, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life, and that big mountain, that fear of man that held you back from doing everything, it's just a little anthill. And you said, I let that little anthill, that fear of man, hold me back from doing it. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven, because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those courageous, faith-filled things that you will be known for forever. Out of the 6,000 years of world history, the good Lord decided for you to be alive right now. He's given you his word. He's given you his Holy Spirit. Everything. You can do this, right? So let's think of a basketball game. And you're on the bench, and Jesus is the coach, and he comes over and he slaps you on the back, and he says, it's your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but somebody just got knocked down. Goes, yeah, I know. You're 7 feet tall, they are 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. This is your time to do those things that you will be known for forever. God bless you. Thank you.